I have a rare cold. My normal problem is speaking far longer than I'm allocated time for because of my throat. Tonight may very well be much shorter. I'd like to thank Just Peace and IPAN for the opportunity to talk to you tonight. I've been asked to speak about the drone warfare and the legality or otherwise of this form of modern combat. When I was asked to give this talk, it made me think about Australia's wider involvement in wars since its foundation as a European colony. There have been a number of possible explanations for Australia's propensity to become involved in other people's wars. Alison just, Annette just mentioned John Menahue's blog, The Pearls and Irritations. My very good friend Alison Bronosky writes regularly for that as well. In an article she wrote, which was published last week, she suggested that it was part of Australia's DNA, or Australians' DNA, to be constantly involved in war. I have a different theory. My preferred theory is that it began as part of the colonial experience, and we'd never really graduated as a mature nation from that status. We're still, in many respects, a colony. That initial experience as a colony saw Australia involved in the Crimean War, 1853 to 1856, which has its own ironies given the present misrepresentations about Russia and Crimea. Our media, in this as in so many areas, as you're undoubtedly aware, simply ignore basic facts, fail to give basic information, and pursue basically a particular viewpoint, which in this case is the constant demonization of Russia. Part of the Crimean War involved an attack upon what was the main Russian naval base at Sevastopol, which is located, of course, in Crimea. And that very same naval base was a major reason for the coup that the Americans organized and financed in February 2014 that overthrew the legitimately elected government of Ukraine and replaced it with what is best described as a neo-Nazi bunch of thugs. Crimea has been part of Russia since 1783, when the Russians defeated the Ottoman forces. Australian troops were also involved in the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, again on behalf of the British Empire in its expansionary policies for influence and control in southern Africa. The First World War, 1914-18, had horrendous losses. Australia, of course, suffered a roughly high number of losses relative to its population, but in terms of sheer numbers, the carnage that was wrought on European nations lives with us to this day. We even got involved in the Russian Civil War from 1917 to 1921. Australian troops were part of the so-called White Army that fought against the Bolshevik Red Army. In that case, they served as part of the British Army because the Australian Prime Minister of the time, Billy Hughes, refused to commit Australian troops following the end of World War I. I suggest that that's probably the last known example of Australian resistance to the demands of empire, with the honourable exception of the Whitlam government I'll come back to Mr. Whitlam. The Royal Australian Navy, however, was involved in the Russian Civil War, carrying out intelligence operations in the Black Sea in late 1918. In World War II, again, there was no Australian national interest involved, at least until Pearl Harbor in December 1941. The British defeat in Singapore in February 1942 was when Australia began its seamless transition from the British to the American Empire. The Korean War in 1950-53, which technically is still going on, there's been no peace treaty for that, simply an armistice that was declared. That is another conflict that is hugely misrepresented in Australian history. This war is the origin of the modern problem with the Korean leader Kim Jong-un, although Western interference in Korea dates back at least until the 1880s, when the Americans sent gunboats to forcibly require Korea to open its borders, having lived quite peacefully for 500 years under a Korean dynasty. And that opened the door to the Japanese interference in Korea. In 1910, Korea became part of the Japanese Empire, and a deal was done with the Americans. The Americans said, we'll have the Philippines, you keep out of that, and you can have Korea. And the Koreans, the Japanese stayed until, of course, 1945. Again, it's extremely difficult to discern a vital Australian interest, notwithstanding the best efforts of those of you old enough to remember the 1950s of communist scaremongering that was so much part of the media landscape at that time. Vietnam, we were involved there from 1962 to 1975. This war, so far as Australia was involved, began in a small way in 1962, but was radically upgraded by Menzies in 1965. Australia's involvement continued until 1972. Again, the history of this war is hugely misrepresented, including but not limited to the horrendous scale of Vietnamese losses. At least 3 million people were killed. The enduring environmental and human damage caused by, among other things, napalm and Agent Orange, not only in Vietnam, but in Cambodia and Laos. Our joined at the hip ally dropped more bombs on neutral Laos and Cambodia during that war than total bombs dropped during the whole of World War II. To this day, children are injured and killed on a weekly basis as they play with unexploded ordnance that is all shiny and they find in the jungle. Many people present here today will recall how deeply unpopular that war was. In fact, it was basically ignored by the politicians until the advent of the Whitlam government in 1972. Again, there was no discernible Australian national interest involved in Vietnam. The Red Scare bogeyman from the 1950s lived on. Some of you may recall the phrase, we fight them there so we don't have to fight them here. How common that phrase was, commonly heard in the 1960s. Afghanistan from 2001 till the present, that's now replaced Vietnam as our longest war. And what has become a very familiar pattern, this war also began on the basis of a series of lies, and those lies continue to the present day. Osama bin Laden, a CIA asset, known in American military circles as Colonel Tim Osman, the leader of Operation Cyclone, which is the training of mujahideen, so-called freedom fighters in Pakistan, for infiltration into Afghanistan and the Central Asian republics of what was then the USSR. The events of 9/11, the ostensible trigger for the Afghan war, only some of the better known falsities. And again, in what is, to me, also a disturbingly similar pattern, there is little or no public or parliamentary debate about Australia's involvement in this illegal war. On the contrary, there is systematic concealment about what is really going on. The real reasons the United States is in Afghanistan and joined at the hip Australia is there as well include, but are not limited to, the geopolitical US objective of encircling China and Russia, the exploitation of mineral resources conservatively estimated at $3 trillion worth, including in particular the so-called rare earths, which are an essential element of modern day technology, and of course control of the lucrative drug trade. According to the United Nations Drug Agency, Afghanistan accounts for 93% of the world's heroin trade. The chemicals that are necessary to refine the raw opium that is grown in the poppy fields under American protection into sellable heroin are flown into Afghanistan on NATO planes. Afghanistan does not have the necessary chemicals or the capability of producing them. Now, none of this information, which is readily available from the United Nations sources, among other places, is ever discussed in the Australian media. Instead, we are treated to this ongoing fiction of being there in a training role for the Afghan army. Nobody can tell me the answer to a simple question. What do you expect to achieve in the next 16 years you've been unable to achieve in the last 16 years? Again, there is no discernible Australian national interest involved in our continuing participation in what is yet again another illegal war. On the contrary, I would argue that our presence there is contrary to Australia's interests. Australia's involvement is only explicable in terms of the United States, our obeisance to the wishes of the United States. It's often referred to, and this is discussed quite frankly when one talks to officials in the Defence Department and DFAT, as in effect being the payment of an insurance policy, on a policy that is predicated on the belief, false in my view, that such payments are necessary to ensure that the United States will come to our rescue in the event that we are ever attacked. The ANZUS Treaty is invariably cited in this context, and I suspect that our politicians rely upon the fact that very few Australians actually know what is in that treaty. Unlike Article 5 of the NATO Treaty, the ANZUS Treaty only requires the parties to consult with each other in accordance with their constitutional procedures in the event that one or other of them is attacked. New Zealand got out of ANZUS in 1984, and last time I looked, my home country was doing exceedingly well. Thank you very much. A pregnant woman Prime Minister to boot. Isn't that wonderful? For reasons that I won't develop in this talk, even if it were true that the United States would change its policies that it has pursued since 1776 and act on behalf of another country's interests rather than self-interest, it would not in all probability affect the outcome of any such war that involved an attack upon Australia. I just digress from my prepared notes here to recall a comment that was made about a year ago by a senior defence official when one of the senior American people, it may well have been the Admiral who's now going to be the ambassador here, saying that what the Americans liked about Australia was that it was a stationary aircraft carrier. And this was a comment made by the American. And the Australian Defence Department official piped up and said, yes, and we're out of range of Chinese missiles. Now, I don't know if he really believes that, but that is dangerous ignorance of the first order. The Chinese Dongfeng 41 missile has a range of 12,000 miles. And last time I looked, the distance from Beijing to Canberra was under 7,000 miles. It flies at hypersonic speeds. It would take approximately 25 minutes if launched in central China to reach any one of Australian cities or places it chose to target. We have no defence against that missile system, which is why I say that if there is a war, our involvement in that war will be over in half an hour. I can't see the Americans rushing in. Suffice perhaps to say that judging by public statements, Australia's defence policy can only be described as delusional. Iraq, 2003 to the present, yet another lie-based war, as was its predecessor, the 1991 Gulf War. We were willing participants in the sanctions that were imposed on Iraq from 1991 to 2003. That sanctions regime killed at least 500,000 Iraqi children. Former US Secretary of State Madeleine Albright was asked about this, and infamously, in my view, and chillingly, she said it was worth it. 500,000 children. The ongoing Iraq war has seen a disturbing element in Australia's involvement in war crimes. You'll be familiar with the publicity in recent days about General Molan and his involvement in Fallujah. I'll come back to that aspect shortly. I'm happy to talk more about Mr. Molan and Fallujah. I've just finished today writing another paper on the topic. Another outstanding disturbing element from this war, given its manifestly false justification and illegality, is that there has been no accountability for the principal persons involved in beginning and carrying on this war. Again, there is an almost complete absence of public or parliamentary debate. Contrary to the experience of the Netherlands, Canada, and the United Kingdom, there has been a blanket refusal to even conduct an inquiry as to how our involvement in that appalling state of affairs came about. That is so, notwithstanding the valiant efforts of the Campaign for an Iraq War Inquiry and similar groups. Syria, 2015, and ongoing. Again, a disturbingly similar pattern of no legal basis, no Australian national interest at stake, being fought on behalf of the United States Empire, no public debate, no parliamentary debate, no accountability for illegality and war crimes, sustained by a false narrative, and replete with multiple misrepresentations of the actions of the Syrian, Iranian, and Russian governments. A few days ago, Syrian air defences shot down an Israeli jet carrying out a bombing raid in Syria. More than 100 such bombing raids have been carried out since that war started by the Israeli Air Force. I was unable to find a single comment in the Australian mainstream media that questioned the right of Israel to bomb a sovereign country. The Israelis retaliated against having one of their planes shot down, the first time for many, many years, by carrying out a series of further bombing raids, hitting Syrian and Iranian targets. The US Secretary of State, Rex Tillerson, said that Israel was, quote, entitled to defend itself. That is a travesty of Article 51 of the UN Charter, which gives countries the right to self-defence. One wonders what crime that appalling country has to commit before it attracts criticism from our political leaders. Which brings me back to Whitlam. I respectfully differ from Jenny Hocking in ascribing the removal of Whitlam to the machinations of the British, although they almost certainly knew what was going on. Much more likely, in my view, was the unhappiness of the American government with Whitlam after he withdrew Australia from participation in the Vietnam War in 1972. This unhappiness was compounded by Whitlam's announced intentions in other areas of foreign and defence policy. Whitlam intended to expose the role of Pine Gap and possibly close it down, or at least terminate its function as an essential component of the US war machine. A man whose name you'll never see mentioned in the Australian media, the name of Marshall Green. Green has a very interesting history. He was nominally a State Department employee, although in reality he would belong to one of the spook agencies. He was sent around the world as required when the Americans were unhappy with the regime running particular countries. So he was sent to Korea, and a coup d'etat was staged there. Fresh from that triumph, he went to Indonesia in 1965, another coup d'etat there. His services were next employed in Chile in 1973, when the Allende government was violently overthrown. And fresh from that triumph, he was sent to Australia, and arriving here in 1974. It is not a coincidence, I believe, that Whitlam was removed as Prime Minister the day before he was due to make a statement to Parliament about Pine Gap and its future role. One has to remember that then, even more so than now, most Australians were profoundly ignorant of Pine Gap's true role. Today, Pine Gap fulfills at least two major functions vital to the US war machine: electronic eavesdropping and being part of a worldwide guidance system for missiles and drones that are increasingly used in regular and irregular warfare around the world. Before exploring that just a little bit further, it's important to note what constitutes a war crime. War crimes, simply expressed, are violations of the laws of war that give rise to individual criminal responsibility. Recognition of the laws of war and the responsibilities attached thereto began with the Hague Conventions in 1899 and 1907. They've been progressively expanded and elaborated upon up to and including the 21st century. An important example of a war crime in the present context is the targeting of cities or groups where there are civilians. It is not necessary that civilians are the targets. It is sufficient that there is recklessness in the use of force, or there is a probability that civilians will be victims. Again, digress just briefly to say that General Molan, now Senator Molan, was seconded from the Australian Defence Forces in early 2004 to the US Defence Forces. He was the commanding officer for the attack on Fallujah in October 2004. Fallujah was surrounded. Messages were given out that civilians were to leave. That exemption did not apply to men the ages of 15 to 45. The city was then destroyed. The only hospital in the city was occupied by the coalition forces and the medical staff taken prisoner. The Red Cross was prevented from bringing in ambulances, first aid, medical aid, humanitarian aid. Snipers gunned down women and children on the streets. Men carrying white flags were gunned down. And there were a whole range of other atrocities as well. Without a question, these are war crimes. And under various principles of international law, the officers commanding the troops who commit the war crimes are legally liable for those crimes, as are the political leadership that authorised the utilisation of military force. Now, General Molan is entitled to the presumption of innocence, like anybody who might be charged with a crime. But he's never been charged, though he could be charged under the provisions of various international instruments that Australia has ratified. He could be charged